Hello, this is part 57 of our comparative Bible study on the beginning of Jesus Galilean Ministry. During this part, we would like to continue our discussion that we began during the last Bible study on verses having to do with confrontation in the Sermon on the Mount, and actually on the Sermon on the Plain during this Bible study also. This is overall our 97th New Testament Bible study. During the last Bible study, we briefly introduced these verses towards the end of Matthew chapter 5 and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. At the very end of the last Bible study, we read and briefly discussed verses 38 and on, which I propose could be viewed as Jesus telling his disciples how to, among other things, respond to confrontation. In wrapping up that Bible study, I mentioned that there's probably a lot more that could be said about these verses. During this Bible study, we would like to compare those verses to comparable verses in the Sermon on the Plain. So please keep in mind these verses here from Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 and after, because we'll display them again here shortly. Now back to the slide that we've been working off of the past several Bible studies. Displayed on the left, we have the beginning verses of the Sermon on the Mount out of the Gospel of Matthew, and on the right, we have the beginning verses of the Sermon on the Plain out of the Gospel of Luke. Notice the last verse in this section of Luke chapter 6 is verse 26. Moving on to the next verse, verse 27, here we have verses 27 through 36 displayed also on the right, and on the left we have those verses from Matthew chapter 5 verses 38 through the end of Matthew chapter 5 displayed on the left. These are the verses we briefly mentioned earlier that I said would come up again. There are more sections to the Sermon on the Mount in between the introductory verses that we just looked at in this section. But for comparison's sake, I'd like to talk about these verses now with the next section of the Sermon on the Plain. As alluded to in a previous Bible study, the Sermon on the Mount is a much longer sermon and has a lot of parts that are not included in the Sermon on the Plain. So here on the right, once again, we have the next section of the Sermon in the Plain from Luke chapter 6. And we have comparable verses from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, which are displayed on the left. To help with comparison, I'd like to highlight similar information in both these sermons with similar colors. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so these are the same verses that were displayed before, but the colors have been changed to match up similar information with other similar information in both sermons. As mentioned earlier, and as I'm proposing now, that among other things, it seems that the Lord Jesus may have been telling his disciples how they are supposed to respond to the confrontational acts of others, at least in some of these verses. Let's begin by comparing what I've highlighted here in light blue, beginning with the Sermon in the Plain. We read, "But I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you." Comparing this to the Sermon on the Mount, we see here this part highlighted in yellow, which is pretty much like a preliminary statement. Then it's contrasted against this part highlighted in blue, which is very similar to what's in the Sermon in the Plain. Here we read in the Sermon on the Mount, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." So in addition to this pre-statement that I highlighted in yellow, a couple of other differences are the Sermon on the Mount has this additional statement, and persecute you, which is not up here in the Sermon in the Plain. Also in the Sermon in the Plain, it uses this qualifying language, which here, which is not in the Sermon on the Mount. And also, bless them that curse you and do good to them that hate you are in reverse order in both sermons. Among other things, the Lord Jesus stated in both sermons, love your enemies. By the way, later on in the Sermon in the Plain, the Lord Jesus will again state, but love ye your enemies. Let's next compare the two parts in the two sermons highlighted in bright green. In the Gospel of Luke, we read, and unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. By comparison, we have similar information, which I've highlighted also in bright green here on the Sermon on the Mount. Similar to the part right before the light blue, there's a preliminary statement that I've highlighted in yellow here right before the part highlighted in bright green also. Let's begin reading in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil. Let's pause here for a brief moment. This preliminary information is not in the Sermon in the Plain, but is here in the Sermon on the Mount, including that ye resist not evil. Let's continue on. You'll see this next part is very similar to what was in the Sermon on the Plain. Here we read, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. So right cheek was specified in the Sermon on the Mount, but a particular side was not specified in the Sermon on the Plain. Now this next part, and if any man will sue thee at the law, is also not in the Sermon on the Plain, but the continuation of that, as we read here, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. So this part is very similar to what was in the Sermon on the Plain. Before we move on to the next part, notice this phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Here are three examples from the Old Testament where that phrase is used. So that phrase had been used before. Lord willing, maybe we'll talk more about this in a future Bible study. Continuing on here in the Sermon on the Mount, notice this next part is not highlighted because it does not appear to be in the Sermon on the Plain. Here we read, and whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. As we continue on with our comparison, the next parts seem to be similar in both sermons. In the Sermon on the Mount it states, give to him that asketh thee. And the Sermon in the Plain states, give to every man that asketh of thee. Now the continuation of these statements in both sermons appears to be a little different, but maybe they're talking about the same thing. In the Sermon on the Mount, it continues, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. And the Sermon in the Plain states, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. So here in the Sermon on the Plain, it appears Jesus is telling his disciples how to respond after somebody already has something that is theirs, but in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling them how they're to respond when somebody asks to borrow from them, before they borrow from them. Continuing with this theme of lending and borrowing, later in the Sermon on the Plain, the Lord Jesus will state, and if ye lend to them of whom ye hope to receive, what think have ye? For sinners also lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest. As noted earlier, the Lord Jesus told his disciples once more here, love ye your enemies. Let's stop here for now. Lord willing, maybe we'll have another Bible study in the future. If I got to share anything good, it's a blessing from God.